Good evening, my friend. Thank you for being here tonight. This is your time to take care of yourself and relax. Your quiet corner of the world where gentle stories wrap around you like a soft blanket at the end of the day, helping you drift into a deep, restful sleep. I'm your host, Melissa, and I'll be reading to you tonight from the Gentle Library. Before we begin, take a moment to settle in. Find a comfortable position, letting your body soften into your bed or blankets. If anything needs to be adjusted, go ahead. This is your moment of gentle self-care. When you're ready, allow your eyes to close. Take a slow, easy breath in and a soft breath out. Let your body begin to unwind as you ease into your nighttime routine. Sometimes the mind continues to wander, offering thoughts and fragments of the day. There's nothing you need to do with them. Let them fade like ripples softening on a still pond, appearing, drifting, dissolving without any effort from you. Take another gentle breath in and let it fall out naturally, giving yourself permission to loosen any stress you're holding. Feel your shoulders drop. Let the tension melt from your jaw. Allow your hands to soften. Let your belly relax. Let your legs grow warm and heavy. With every breath, you're giving your body a moment of calm, comfort, and restoration. If thoughts come, and they will, you don't need to push them away. Just notice them with kindness. Let them drift by like clouds crossing a quiet evening sky. There's nothing you need to solve right now. Nothing to manage. Nothing to carry. Just gentle, steady relaxation. Your breath naturally slows. Your muscles settle. And a peaceful sense of emotional well-being begins to spread through you. This is a moment to unwind, to reconnect with yourself, to release the weight of the day, to prepare your mind and body for deep, restful sleep. Let each exhale soften you a little more. And now, when you feel ready, begin to imagine a peaceful place, somewhere safe, soothing, and comforting. Maybe a quiet farmhouse with warm cinnamon drifting through the air. A cozy room lit by soft lamplight. A gentle rain tapping on the window. Or any place your heart recognizes as calm and restorative. Let that place form slowly, gently, and allow its warmth to surround you. This is where tonight's story begins. There are certain smells that can pull you out of the present and carry you gently and completely into another decade. For June, it was always bread. Not the bright, yeasty scent of store-bought loaves wrapped in crinkling plastic, but the deep, warm, lived-in aroma of bread rising and baking in a small kitchen. Bread that fed 7 people for years. Bread that made a house feel less like a structure and more like a promise. You will not go hungry here. You will be welcomed. You will be loved. On winter evenings now, when the world outside her own window grew quiet and the light turned soft and blue, June sometimes baked a loaf. Not every day, not like her mother had, but often enough that flour dust had found its way into the cracks of her countertop. She'd measure and stir and knead, and as the dough began to come together under her hands, the years began to loosen. Tonight, snow brushed against the glass in lazy, uneven strokes. The sky had that heavy winter softness that said Christmas wasn't far away. A small lamp glowed on the corner of the counter, leaving the rest of the kitchen in gentle shadow. June had shaped the dough already, set it into a pan, and covered it with a clean cloth to rise. Now she rested her hands on the edge of the counter and simply watched. The rounded shape under the cloth looked almost like someone breathing. She smiled faintly. "All right, Mama," she thought, "take me back." And, as it had so many times before, the smell of bread, not yet baked, but already alive, opened a door in her memory. It was a Sunday in the 1950s, the kind of winter Sunday that began with cold air on bare shins and ended with a quilt pulled up under your chin. They lived in a small town somewhere in the wide, flat middle of the Midwest. The town never felt the need to name itself in her memories. It was simply town, and beyond that, country. Snow had fallen overnight, and now A new dusting was drifting down from a soft, low sky. The world outside their house was quiet, muffled, as if someone had placed a hand over the mouth of the landscape in a playful hush. Their house sat on the outskirts of town in the country, the kind of simple, sturdy place built to withstand winters and hold growing families. In the backyard, an old well and a huge lilac bush waited under its coat of snow, its branches bare and patient. Along the back fence, rows of raspberry canes stood like thin, sleeping shadows, the same ones that Matthew and Douglas flew past in the warmer months on their bicycles, shouting to each other as they raced the wind. Near the back corner of the yard, the small chicken coop shed, huddled under its own cap of snow, quiet now, though in summer it clucked and rustled with busy life. Beyond the fence, the neighbors' cows grazed there in other seasons, their slow, gentle presence, a kind of moving backdrop to the children's days. Now, just dark shapes in June's memory, standing in a field that winter had wrapped in white. In the front yard, a swing set stood like a small skeleton, its chains stiff with cold. Along the front of the house, the flower beds where peony bushes would bloom in great pink and white clouds come spring lay hidden under the snow, and the strip of soil beneath the house where iris flowers lifted their tall, elegant heads in summer was now just a smooth, unbroken drift. In the warmer months, the lilacs perfumed the entire yard. The raspberries stained small fingers red. The peonies drooped heavily under their own sweetness, and the irises lined the house like a quiet, colorful procession. The swings creaked under the weight of 5 children and their endless games. But today, all of it stood still, tucked into the sparkling white snow. Inside, though, it was another world entirely. Inside, there was bread. Hannah had been up early, long before church, tying her apron around her waist with the practiced hands of a woman who did this nearly every day. Her hair was pinned back, her rosary already tucked into her pocket after a quiet prayer in the dim light of the living room. She moved through the kitchen with the soft efficiency of habit. Flour, water, yeast, salt. She didn't so much measure as remember, hands knowing what the recipe required without needing to check a card. The wooden bowl she used had belonged to her mother before her. More than one generation of bread had risen in it. As the dough came together, she kneaded it on the table, pressing and folding in a slow, steady rhythm. The kitchen was chilly at first, until the oven was lit and the room began to gather heat around her. On Sundays, the sound of the old radio floated in from the living room, soft organ music and murmured voices from the early program Joseph liked to tune in. Later, There would be baseball, the crackle and buzz of distant crowds coming through the speaker. But for now, it was just low, comforting noise. Upstairs, footsteps thumped and water ran. Douglas, the oldest, was always the first to be ready for church, pressed and serious. When the weather was good, he was also the one who could coax an extra few minutes outside, pushing off down the road on his bike with Matthew close behind, their wheels cutting thin tracks in the dust as they rode past the raspberries, the chicken coop, and the neighbor's cows, always looking back just in time to make it home when Hannah called. Matthew moved more slowly this morning, distracted by whatever book or idea had hold of him. Ronald, lean and quick, seemed to combine the chaos of both. June and Sabrina, the youngest two, shared a room, brushing their hair as best they could and helping each other with buttons that never quite lined up on the first try. By the time the family came down for breakfast, the dough had already done its first rise. It rested under a towel, a quiet, swelling presence on the kitchen table. "Bread again?" Ronald asked, as though it were a surprise. "Bread again," Hannah replied. "You expect me to feed 5 children and your father with just air?" Joseph slid into his seat, hanging his coat over the back of the chair. He was a broad-shouldered man, worn at the edges by work at the shoe factory. But he held himself with a kind, unhurried dignity. He pressed a kiss to Hannah's cheek as she passed. "You'll turn us all into dough," he teased, "soft and round." "Speak for yourself," she said, patting his shoulder. "You need it, putting in all those hours." Breakfast was simple. Leftover bread toasted, eggs, and a bit of jam when they had it. The children ate quickly, casting glances at the clock. Church was never far away on a Sunday. It sat in the center of their week, a quiet insistence, like the ticking of that very grandfather clock. Hannah had a way of making even the rush to get out the door feel purposeful rather than frantic. Coats went on, scarves were untangled, hats were located. She found a missing glove behind the radiator, shook her head, and tucked it into Jane's hand as though she'd just plucked it from a tree. Her rosary slipped into her coat pocket once more, beads cool against her fingers. She always carried it, even if she didn't always speak the prayers aloud. The rhythm of the beads through her hands was a kind of quiet that she could reach for at any time. They drove to church together, boots crunching through the snow from the car to the old church entrance, breath rising in small white puffs. The day had that peculiar brightness of winter. No sun, but everything still strangely illuminated. Inside the church, candles flickered near statues, and the smell of wax, wood polish, and wool coats created its own kind of incense. Hannah knelt in their usual pew, the children kneeling beside her in a less practiced but earnest version of the pose. Joseph's hands strong and broad from his work, folded around his hat. Missals rustled, hymns rose and fell. The priest's voice moved over them, words about hope and perseverance, about light coming into the world in the darkest part of the year. June didn't grasp every phrase, but she understood the feeling, the sense that even the coldest days were held inside something larger. When they returned home, the house welcomed them with warmth that felt almost alive. The kitchen, especially, seemed to lean toward them. They opened the door to the rich, yeasty smell of dough that had risen while they were gone, a promise waiting patiently under cloth. "Oh," Douglas said, his usual reserve undone for a moment. "It's ready." "Of course it's ready," Hannah said, untying her scarf. "It's Sunday." They shed their layers, coats, hats, scarves, and gloves, and hung them on a coat tree near the door, damp wool releasing the faint scent of snow and effort. Joseph went to the radio and turned the dial until the familiar crackle of pre-game chatter emerged. The voices of the commentators felt like distant cousins, always present on certain afternoons. In the living room, the old upright radio stood on its table like a piece of furniture that had forgotten it wasn't a person. Its rounded wood gleamed softly in the light from the window. Joseph adjusted the knob, a little orange glow inside brightening. "Well," he said, settling into his chair with a soft sigh, "let's see if they can pull it off this time." "Bread first," Hannah reminded him, but the teasing in her voice made it clear she was not about to scold him out of enjoying his game. Back in the kitchen, she uncovered the dough. It had grown, a pale, smooth dome, rising above the rim of the bowl. Hannah placed her fingertips lightly on its surface, pressing just enough to feel its resistance. "Perfect," she murmured. "It's a good day." She turned the dough out onto the floured table, and the children gathered, each drawn by their own reasons: hunger, curiosity, the allure of helping, or simply the need to be where their mother's hands were. She divided the dough with a practiced cut, shaping each portion into a loaf with firm, gentle motions. Her fingers folded and pressed, tucked and smooth. It was like watching someone pray with their hands. "Can I try?" June asked. Hannah handed her a small piece of dough, warm and pliant. "Gently," she said. "It listens to you." June cupped it in her small hands, mimicking her mother's motions. The dough yielded, imperfectly shaped, but no less alive. "That's it," Hannah said. "We'll bake that one too." She placed the loaves into their pans, the big ones first, then June's small, oddly shaped one, then slid them into the oven. The door closed with a familiar thud. She set the timer in her mind. She hardly ever needed the clock. "Now we wait," she said. Waiting in that house never meant nothing was happening. In the living room, Joseph's radio game had picked up pace. the announcer's voice rose and fell, describing plays and near misses in a cadence that was almost musical. Joseph leaned forward occasionally, elbows on his knees, listening like a man who'd learned to enjoy victories and accept losses without letting either define him. Hannah sat in her favorite chair near the window, a basket of fabric strips and squares at her feet. Her quilting was another kind of bread, small pieces of cloth stitched together into something that warmed and comforted. She threaded her needle and began to sew, the fine, precise stitches marching across fabric that had once been dresses, shirts, aprons. Nothing wasted, everything repurposed into care. Sabrina, who looked more like her than any of the others, the same curve of cheek, the same quiet intensity in her eyes, sat nearby with her own piece of fabric, trying to follow her mother's example. Her stitches were uneven, but Hannah never corrected them too sharply. "Every quilt tells on me," Hannah often said. "People can see exactly when the children helped." Ronald drifted between rooms, unable to sit for long, hovering in the doorway between the warm kitchen and the equally warm living room, torn between the pull of the bread and the pull of the game. Of all of them, he was the one who loved popcorn the most, and already he was eyeing the pot on the stove. "Later," Hannah said, catching his look. "Popcorn is a nighttime treat. We've only had lunch." He sighed dramatically and plopped down on the rug, close enough to the radio to hear every word. Time moved differently on those Sundays, thick and slow like honey. Outside, the snow continued its quiet work of softening the edges of the world. The swing set in the front yard disappeared further into the white. The lilac bush in the back stood like a sleeping giant, branches cradling small drifts. The raspberry canes and the neat rows where peonies and irises would one day flare into color were buried and still, waiting for the right season to come alive again, the same way the children waited for long, bright evenings when Douglas and Matthew could ride their bikes in lazy circles around the yard while the neighbors' cows grazed just beyond the fence. Inside, the bread rose in the oven, the house filling more and more with its scent. That smell was a presence all its own. It found its way into everything. Some houses smelled of lemon cleaner or perfume. Theirs smelled of bread. June sat at the table with a book open in front of her, though every few minutes she glanced toward the oven door as if she could see time moving more quickly if she just stared hard enough. At last, Hannah stood, setting aside her quilting. She moved to the oven, opened it just enough to peer inside, and then drew out the pans with the thick, worn potholders that had known as much heat as any hands could bear. The loaves emerged, crusts deepening into warm brown, the tops smooth and rounded. Even June's small, lopsided one had bloomed in its own way. A soft sigh seemed to pass through the room, as though everyone, Even those who hadn't been consciously waiting registered the arrival of something central and right. "Let them rest," Hannah said, as she always did. "They've worked hard." Rest in that house was not reserved only for people. The loaves cooled on wire racks, their crusts making tiny crackling sounds as the air touched them. The children hovered, giving them space because they'd been taught to, but close enough that the scent washed over them in waves. Dinner would come later, a simple meal of soup, perhaps, or stew, something stretched carefully to many bowls. But the bread would be the heart of it, slices thick and generous. Hannah picked up her rosary again while she waited, letting the beads move through her fingers, each one a familiar waypoint. Her lips moved now and then, words soft and indistinct, more like breath than speech. It was less about asking for specific things and more about staying in conversation with something beyond herself. To the children, this too was simply part of the weather of their home, the quiet clicking of beads, like the ticking of the grandfather clock or the whir of the radio. With the passing years, the family naturally grew and scattered in their own directions. Even so, the house kept their imprint in the things they had touched and in the rooms that had once held their songs, their prayers, their lessons, their joy, and their laughter. It lingered in the scuffed wood stairs from little feet racing down the staircase, the pencil marks on the doorway showing how quickly everyone grew, the quilt squares stitched during long winter afternoons, the chip bowls used 100 times over, the upstairs well-worn banister smoothed by many hands, the squeaky stair everyone tried to avoid, and the little pantry that always seemed to hold the faint, comforting scent of warm cookies and spice. By the time June was middle-aged herself, the house in that small town belonged as much to memory as to reality. The lilac bush grew on, its blooms fragrant each spring. The swing set rusted slowly, its chains still creaking in the wind. For June, that house would always be caught in that particular light of those Sundays. She could still see, if she tried, Douglas and Matthew racing past the front window on their bikes in summer, circling back toward the backyard, while neighbors' cows lifted their heads, chewing thoughtfully as if they were the quiet audience to every childhood adventure. And yet, life went on. She built a life of her own in another town, with another kitchen and another set of windows framing winter. The world changed around her in all the usual ways. New inventions, new worries, new routines. But some things she chose to carry forward. The bread, especially. She didn't bake it daily, but on certain evenings, usually near Christmas, when the snow outside her window began to fall just so, she would reach for flour, yeast, salt, for the old wooden spoon that had been Hannah's, for the recipe card written in her mother's careful, slightly leaning hand. In truth, she hardly needed the card anymore, but she liked seeing her mother's handwriting, the way the letters curved, the small smudge of something near the bottom, where perhaps a fingerprint of dough had touched the paper years ago. And in those moments, with her sleeves rolled up and her hands in the dough, the distance between decades collapsed. Back in her present-day kitchen, the dough under the cloth had swollen slightly, pushing upward. June lifted the edge of the cloth and smiled at what she saw. "Not bad," she murmured. "You've still got it." She dusted her hands with flour and gently pressed her fingertips into the dough, feeling its resilience, its eagerness. As she turned it out onto the counter to shape it, another memory rose, a particular Sunday, now fused in her mind with all the other Sundays, but still standing out like a star that shines a little brighter than the rest. It was close to Christmas that day. She could tell from the way the house had looked as they drove home from church. The wreath on the door, the small string of lights her father had hung along the eaves, the extra care her mother had taken in tying her scarf. The snow had been falling then, too, fine and steady. The world had felt wrapped. After dinner, when bread and soup had warmed them from the inside, Hannah had gone back to her quilting, the basket of fabric at her feet. Joseph had tuned the radio not to baseball this time, but to a station that played Christmas music, choirs and orchestras, carols that rose and fell like the breath of the whole town. In the kitchen, as the afternoon settled into early dusk, Hannah had stood up again. "All right," she had said, stretching her back slightly. "We need one more loaf. Tomorrow we'll be busy." The family had plans. The children would be in and out of the house. Preparations would be made. Relatives expected. Bread would be needed the way air was needed, the way warmth was needed. "Already?" Sabrina asked, looking up from where she sat on the rug with a book. "Bread doesn't know the calendar," Hannah said. "It just knows whether it's needed, and tomorrow it will be." June watched as her mother began again, measuring, mixing, stirring. Her motions were slower now, perhaps than they had been years earlier, but still sure. The dough came together as it always did under those hands. This time, though, something else happened. As Hannah kneaded, June noticed her lips moving. It wasn't unusual for her mother to talk a little while she worked. Soft comments to herself, reminders, the occasional sigh. But this day, the words were more structured. They didn't quite match the prayers June knew by heart, but they had that same cadence, rising and falling like the ocean she'd only ever seen in movies. "What are you saying, Mama?" June had asked, curiosity overpowering her sense that perhaps she shouldn't interrupt. Hannah had glanced up, surprised, then smiled. "Oh," she said, "just talking to God about flour." "Flour?" June had echoed. "Well," Hannah said, leaning into the dough, "about you." about all of you, about how grateful I am that I can still stretch what we have into something that feeds you, about how I'm tired and grateful and worried and hopeful. It all comes out better if my hands are busy. She paused, then added, sometimes the rosary is too small for all of it. Bread gives me more to hold on to. She didn't say it in a dramatic way. It was simply the truth, spoken over the soft thump of dough on wood. June had watched in silence after that, understanding dimly that the act of making bread was bigger than it looked, that it was not just about ingredients and hunger, but about prayer and perseverance and love that had to be renewed constantly, not just on holidays. The bread had risen, baked, and cooled. Later that night, as snow piled up outside and the house grew quiet after the clatter of the day, they'd made popcorn. They made popcorn so often that the sound of it still lived in June's bones. The first few hesitant pops in the pot, then the rush of it, like rain on a roof. Ronald, always the first to smell it, would appear in the kitchen doorway as if summoned. I heard it from upstairs, he'd say, though no one believed he'd ever actually made it to the second floor once he knew popcorn was on the horizon. They'd sit together, bowls in their laps, fingers growing salty. The living room would be lit only by the small lamps, and if they had it up by then, the lights of the Christmas tree. Conversation would lull and rise, quieter than daytime talk, words floating on the edge of drowsiness. Those nights had felt, at the time, like they would go on forever. June shaped the present-day loaf with the same motions she'd seen 1,000 times. Fold, tuck, smooth. The dough yielded, obedient, ready. She placed it into the pan, covered it again, and set it near the warm oven to rise a second time. As she washed her hands at the sink, she caught her reflection in the dark window, her own face framed by the glass with snow drifting behind it. For a moment, she saw her mother's features there instead, just a glimpse, like a double exposure, just an echo. She thought of Sabrina then too, her younger sister, whose resemblance to Hannah had always been more striking. When they were together, sometimes it was like seeing their mother at 2 points in time, the past and a possible present overlapping. They spoke often now, calls on the phone, messages back and forth, photos shared of small, everyday things. They talked about their children, their health, the state of the world. Less often, but more deeply, they talked about those days in that old house, about Douglas's dry humor, Matthew's thoughtful quiet, Ronald's restless energy, about their father's hands and their mother's bread. June dried her hands and reached for her phone on the counter. She hovered for a moment over Sabrina's name, tempted to call and say, "Guess what I'm baking?" But she decided to wait. She liked the idea of letting the story finish rising first. The loaf went into the oven, and slowly the house transformed. The scent of baking bread is not in a hurry. It arrives in layers. At first, just a suggestion, something warm, something vaguely familiar. Then, more insistently, the deepening note of crust, the tiny sweetness of browning. It threads its way into the corners of a room, up the stairs, down the hallway. In June's kitchen, the air turned golden. The lamplight seemed to soften as if responding. She found herself moving more slowly, as though her steps needed to match the unhurried expansion of the bread. She made herself a cup of tea and sat at the small table by the window, watching the snow. Outside, cars moved more cautiously now. The world hadn't stopped, but it had agreed to slow its pace for a little while. Inside, time folded gently back on itself. She could see as clearly as if it were a film playing on the frost, her father tuning the radio, her mother threading a needle, Ronald leaning against the door jamb, waiting for popcorn. She could hear the low murmur of their voices, the occasional burst of laughter. She could see herself as a girl, elbows on the table, chin in her hands, watching the oven door. She could see Sabrina's profile lit by the glow of the tree. She could almost hear, too, the faint clatter of bicycle wheels on summer gravel out by the road, Douglas and Matthew calling to each other as they looped around the yard and racing inside for a slice of fresh bread. All of them occupied the same space, layered like the pieces of one of Hannah's quilts. Different fabrics, different times, stitched together into something that could still keep you warm long after some of those pieces had frayed. The oven timer chimes softly, a more modern sound than the old kitchen clock's steady ticking, but not disruptive. June rose, set down her mug, and opened the oven. The loaf that emerged was not identical to her mother's. How could it be? Her flour was different. Her oven was more precise. The year on the calendar many decades removed, but it carried enough of the same spirit that when she set it on the rack, she had to take a breath before she could trust her voice. "Hello, old friend," she said quietly. The crust crackled as it cooled, tiny sounds that could almost have been words. She waited, letting it rest, resisting the urge to slice too soon. Some respect had to be paid to the process. When at last she did cut into it, the knife passed through the crust with a satisfying resist and give. The interior was soft, steaming, textured, with the small, irregular holes that spoke of a good rise and a living dough. She cut herself a slice and placed it on a small plate, added a little butter that melted almost instantly into the crumb. She carried it back to the table and sat down. For a moment, she didn't eat. She just held the plate and let the steam rise, carrying with it every kitchen she had ever known. Then she took a bite. The taste was simple: flour, water, salt, time. But it was also something larger. It was Hannah's hands pressing. It was Joseph's laughter, low and tired, at the end of a long work shift. It was Douglas's quiet smile, Matthew's thoughtful questions, Ronald's popcorn-stained fingers. It was Sabrina's face now on the other end of so many phone calls. It was the 1950s and today. Church bells and car horns, snow-covered lilacs and home radiators clicking on. It was the raspberries along the fence, the irises standing tall by the house, the soft clucking from the chicken coop, the neighbor cows grazing just beyond the yard. All of it somehow present in that one piece of warm bread. She finished the slice slowly. When the last crumbs were gone, she sat back and wrapped her hands around her mug of tea again, now lukewarm, but still comforting. The loaf rested on the counter, starlight beginning to catch on the edges of the snow outside. June washed her plate and cup, set them in the sink. She wrapped the cooled loaf in a clean cloth, leaving it on the counter for tomorrow's breakfast. Before she turned out the kitchen light, she stood for a moment in the doorway and looked back at the beads Mama's old rosary coiled now in a small dish by the window, a loaf of bread, a mug, a towel, a scattering of flour on the counter. To her, it was a whole world. She could hear, if she let herself, the faint echo of that old radio, the pop of kernels in a pot, the low murmur of a woman's voice praying with her hands buried in dough. "Good night, Mama," she said softly. She switched off the light and walked down the hall, the smell of bread following her like a blanket. Upstairs, she slipped into bed, the quiet of the house folding around her. Outside, the snow continued to fall, whitening the world, softening its edges. As she slipped toward sleep, she understood in a drowsy, peaceful way. She was still rising, still becoming, the way dough quietly turns into the bread that nourishes the next day. Her last waking image was of the old kitchen table, the bowl, her mother's hands, of a Sunday afternoon in the 1950s after church, when a house in a small town smelled of warm bread and everyone she loved was still under one roof. And as the quiet of the night gathered around her, June felt herself drifting too, eased by memory, wrapped in warmth, and carried gently toward rest. The thought of Mama's homemade bread, still soft and comforting in her mind, as she slipped peacefully into sleep. Sleep deeply now. Let the rain keep you company.